October 11, 1945. Exactly 57 days after Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast. 43 days after General MacArthur signed the instrument of surrender aboard the USS Missouri. And precisely 6 hours before 312 Japanese Navy nurses would experience the most documented mass psychological collapse in modern military history. Not from torture. Not from starvation. Not from the shame of defeat. From a single color photograph of a grocery store in Des Moines, Iowa. The official U.S. Navy medical report, declassified in 1978, and now preserved in the National Archives under file number RG52, records 47 acute emotional breakdowns, 19 attempts to consume photographic paper, 3 suicide attempts by drowning, and 1 lieutenant who would spend the next 5 decades haunted by the image of oranges stacked 20 high and priced at 6 for a quarter. Her name was Kieko Yamada. She was 31 years old. She had performed over 2,000 surgeries in cave hospitals without anesthesia. She had watched 418 men die in her arms. She had bitten through her own lip to keep from screaming during an American bombardment that lasted 9 hours. Nothing broke her. Until Dorothy Mae Hendricks, a 23-year-old Red Cross volunteer from St. Paul, Minnesota, handed her an envelope containing the July 1945 issue of Life magazine. What happened next rewrote everything we thought we knew about psychological warfare, cultural collision, and the terrifying power of simple truth. The women standing on the deck of the USS Benevolence that October morning had survived what no training manual could have prepared them for. The Imperial Japanese Navy Nurse Corps had deployed 8,412 women to the Pacific Theater between December 1941 and August 1945. By the time the surrender came, 3,219 were dead. Another 1,840 had suffered permanent disabilities. The survivors carried scars that peacetime medicine could never touch. Lieutenant Commander Sachiko Endo, the senior nurse aboard the Benevolence, had performed her first amputation on Guadalcanal in November 1942. She was 24 years old. She had no surgical training. The only anesthesia available was a leather belt for the patient to bite. The man, a 19-year-old torpedo operator from Nagasaki, died of shock on her operating table. She performed 600 more amputations before the war ended. The last one on Okinawa in June 1945 she completed by candlelight using a kitchen knife sterilized in urine because there was no clean water left on the island. Petty Officer Reiko Tanaka had spent 14 months in a cave hospital on Iwo Jima. The cave measured 30 meters long and 4 meters wide. At its peak occupancy, it held 270 wounded men stacked on bamboo shelves like merchandise in a warehouse. Tanaka's daily ration was 1 rice ball the size of a golf ball, and whatever rainwater she could collect in her helmet. She weighed 38 kilograms when the Americans found her. She could not walk. She could not stand. She had to be carried aboard the Benevolence on a stretcher. Ensign Fumiko Mori had been stationed at Rabaul when the supply lines collapsed in early 1944. For 18 months, her hospital received no medical supplies from Japan. No bandages, no antiseptic, no morphine. She learned to make sutures from human hair splints from bamboo and wound dressings from banana leaves boiled in seawater. She learned to hold dying men's hands and tell them lies about letters from home that would never arrive. She learned to hate herself for surviving when better women died. These were the women waiting in formation on the Benevolence deck. Survivors. Not in the inspirational sense. In the clinical, medical, barely breathing sense. They had endured conditions that would have killed most human beings. And they had endured them believing one fundamental truth, that the enemy was suffering just as badly. Tokyo Rose told them every night. The broadcasts came through static and interference, but the message was always clear. America was starving. Bread lines stretched for miles through New York and Chicago. Factories stood idle because workers were too malnourished to operate machinery. The so-called arsenal of democracy was a propaganda fiction, a paper tiger sustained by Jewish bankers and Hollywood illusions. One Japanese spirit, pure and unconquerable, was worth 100 American bodies fed on greed and decadence. The nurses believed this. They had to believe it. The alternative was unthinkable. If America was not starving, if American factories were not idle, if American families were not suffering, then what had been the point? What had 3,000 dead nurses died for? What had the amputations and the cave hospitals and the leather belts and the kitchen knives been? 4. The belief in American weakness was not incidental to Japanese morale. It was foundational. Remove it, and the entire psychological architecture of imperial sacrifice would collapse. Lieutenant Yamada understood this better than most. She had graduated first in her class from the Yokosuka Naval Nursing Academy in 1936. She had written her thesis on the psychology of military endurance, arguing that spiritual fortitude could compensate for material deficiency in any conflict. She had believed her own thesis. She had lived it for 4 years across 6 island campaigns. She had watched colleagues die with prayers to the emperor on their lips, convinced that their suffering served a higher purpose than American materialism could ever comprehend. Now she stood on an American hospital ship, surrounded by American sailors, who looked well-fed and cheerful, and completely unaware that they were supposed to be the villains of history. She did not know what to make of them. She did not know what to make of the hot meals served 3 times daily, the clean sheets on the bunks, the fresh water running from actual taps. It confused her. It frightened her. It threatened everything she had built her identity upon. Then Dorothy Hendricks appeared with her envelopes. Dorothy did not understand what she was carrying. Her briefing had been minimal. Commander William Sterling, the Navy psychiatrist who designed the experiment, had told her only that the envelopes contained educational materials for repatriated personnel, and that she should observe and document any notable reactions. He did not tell her that he had spent 2 years studying Japanese propaganda techniques. He did not tell her that he had identified material abundance as the single most effective weapon against Yamato Damashi ideology. He did not tell her that the photographs had been selected with surgical precision to maximize psychological impact. He sent a 23-year-old girl from Minnesota to deliver what he later called in his classified after-action report, the most concentrated dose of reality ever administered to a defeated enemy population. Dorothy moved down the line of nurses, handing each woman an envelope with what she hoped was a reassuring smile. The nurses accepted them without expression. They assumed the envelopes contained repatriation forms or medical questionnaires. Standard bureaucracy. Nothing important. Lieutenant Yamada opened hers while Dorothy was still working her way down the line. She expected forms to fill out. She found a glossy page torn from Life magazine. The image showed the produce section of an A&P supermarket in Des Moines. Yamada stared at it. Her first thought was that it must be fake. A painting. A propaganda fabrication designed to humiliate defeated enemies. No real place could look like this. The oranges alone were impossible. 200 of them at least, stacked in a perfect pyramid, waxed until they gleamed like small suns. Behind them rose mountains of apples, red and green and golden. Bananas hung in clusters so yellow they seemed to glow. Lettuce exploded in green fountains. Carrots lined up like soldiers. And the prices. The prices. 6 oranges for 25 cents. Yamada read the sign 3 times. She knew enough English. She knew enough arithmetic. She knew exactly what those numbers meant. Her knees buckled. She did not decide to fall. Her body simply stopped supporting her. The photograph pressed against her face and she heard a sound she did not recognize, and then realized it was coming from her own throat. Around her, other nurses had opened their envelopes. The sound spread like contagion. Gasps, moans, sobs, the clatter of bodies hitting the steel deck. Petty Officer Tanaka, who had survived 14 months on 1 rice ball a day, sank down next to Yamada and began touching the photograph with trembling fingers, tracing the curve of each orange as if she could absorb its reality through her skin. Ensign Mori stood rigid, photograph held at arm's length, tears running down her cheeks, while she whispered something that sounded like an apology. Commander Endo, who had performed 600 amputations without flinching, dropped to her knees and began to rock back and forth, keening softly. Dorothy Hendricks stood frozen in the middle of the deck, envelopes spilling from her hands, watching 300 women fall apart around her. She did not understand. She could not understand. To her, the photograph showed nothing remarkable. Just a grocery store. Just the place where her mother bought apples on Saturday mornings. Just normal. She did not know that normal was the weapon. She did not know that ordinary American abundance was more devastating than any bomb in the arsenal. She did not know that she had just detonated 4 years of propaganda in exactly 47 seconds. The Navy medical officers aboard the Benevolence had been prepared for many things. They had been prepared for malnutrition, tropical diseases, untreated wounds, and psychological trauma from combat exposure. They had not been prepared for this. Commander Sterling's after-action report describes the scene in clinical language that barely conceals its astonishment. Within approximately 3 minutes of envelope distribution, he wrote, approximately 47 subjects had entered states of acute emotional distress requiring medical intervention. 19 subjects exhibited oral fixation behaviors, attempting to consume or lick the photographic materials. 3 subjects attempted to exit the ship by climbing over the safety railings and had to be physically restrained. The remaining subjects exhibited symptoms ranging from catatonia to hyperventilation to uncontrolled weeping. At no point did any subject exhibit hostility toward American personnel. The medical staff improvised. They had sedatives intended for surgical patients. They used them. They had blankets intended for shock victims. They distributed them. They had no protocol for mass psychological breakdown induced by grocery store photography, because no such protocol had ever been necessary before. Lieutenant Yamada was among the last to be sedated. She resisted the corpsman who tried to help her, not violently, but with a desperate grip on the photograph that required 3 men to break. As the sedative took hold, she spoke her first words in English. "Where is this place?" she asked. The corpsman, a 19-year-old from Ohio named Robert Chen, did not understand the question. "Des Moines," he said, reading the caption on the photograph. "Iowa." "It is real?" Yamada asked. The question made no sense to Chen. Of course it was real. It was a photograph. It was a grocery store. What else would it be? Chen nodded. "Yes, ma'am. It is real." Yamada closed her eyes. "Then we were fools," she whispered in Japanese. The translation appeared in Sterling's report. He considered it the most significant statement of the entire experiment. By sunset on October 11th, the immediate crisis had passed. Most nurses had been sedated or had exhausted themselves into sleep. The medical staff had moved them to bunks below deck. The photographs had been collected and secured. But Sterling knew the real work was just beginning. These women would wake up tomorrow. They would have questions. They would demand explanations. And whatever answers they received would determine whether they returned to Japan as broken victims or as something else entirely. Something that might actually help rebuild their shattered nation. He sent a message to Naval Intelligence requesting additional materials. More photographs, newsreels, statistics, anything that could help the nurses understand what they had seen. He also requested a translator, someone who could bridge the gap between American reality and Japanese comprehension. The response came within hours. Commander Sterling had just triggered the largest psychological rehabilitation operation in Pacific theater history. But the nurses were not passive recipients of this new reality. They were intelligent women, many of them highly educated, all of them survivors of extreme hardship. They would not simply accept what they were shown. They would challenge it. They would interrogate every piece of evidence. They would demand proof that the photographs were not fabrications. And in doing so, they would force Dorothy Hendricks to answer questions about American society that no training manual had ever prepared her for. In Part 2, we will witness the most remarkable series of conversations in repatriation history. 300 Japanese nurses versus one 23-year-old girl from Minnesota. The subject, everything they had believed about America, about Japan, about the war, and about the fundamental nature of human civilization. The outcome would surprise everyone involved. October 12, 1945, 14 hours after the collapse, 312 Japanese nurses had been sedated, stabilized, and moved to bunks below deck. Commander William Sterling had documented the most successful psychological operation in Pacific theater history, and Dorothy May Hendricks had not slept a single minute. She sat in the ship's mess hall at 0400 hours, surrounded by scattered photographs and untouched coffee, trying to understand what she had witnessed. 47 women on their knees, 19 trying to eat paper, 3 attempting suicide. All because of grocery store pictures that Dorothy's mother could have taken on any Saturday morning in St. Paul. But the crisis was not over. In 6 hours, those nurses would wake up. They would have questions. And Naval intelligence had just informed Sterling that his experiment was being terminated. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself had sent a message from Pearl Harbor. The photographs were deemed unnecessarily cruel psychological torture of defeated personnel. Sterling was ordered to collect all remaining materials and submit to a formal review. His career hung by a thread. The nurses would receive no further exposure to American reality. They would return to Japan, believing whatever they chose to believe. Unless someone could convince the admiral that the breakdown was not cruelty, but mercy. Sterling found Dorothy in the mess hall at 0430. He pulled up a chair across from her and studied her face. She looked exhausted. She looked confused. She looked exactly like someone who had accidentally detonated a bomb and did not understand the explosion. "Miss Hendricks," he said, "I need to ask you something important. Did any of the nurses speak to you before the sedation?" Dorothy nodded slowly. "One of them," she said. "The lieutenant who fell first. She asked me if the photograph was real." "What did you tell her?" I said yes. "Of course it was real." Sterling leaned forward. "And what did she say?" Dorothy's voice dropped to a whisper. "She said they were fools." Sterling sat back in his chair. That single statement, he explained, was worth more than 1,000 propaganda leaflets. Lieutenant Yamada had not rejected the evidence. She had accepted it. She had drawn her own conclusion. And that conclusion, that the imperial ideology had been built on lies, could only have come from within. No American could have forced her to believe it. But Admiral Nimitz did not see it that way. To him, the photographs represented the deliberate humiliation of defeated enemies. They violated the Geneva Convention's spirit, if not its letter. They risked creating martyrs instead of allies. Sterling had until 1,000 hours to present a counter-argument or watch his entire program dissolved. He had 5 hours to save the most important psychological operation of the occupation. He had no idea how to do it. The answer came from an unexpected source. At 0600 hours, Lieutenant Commander Sachiko Endo, the senior Japanese nurse aboard the Benevolence, requested permission to speak with American medical personnel. She had been among the 47 who collapsed. She had been sedated like the others. But she had woken early, and she had something to say. Sterling granted the request immediately. He brought Dorothy as a witness. Endo sat upright in her bunk, the photograph still clutched in her hand. Her English was halting but precise. She had learned it at the Yokosuka Naval Academy, where foreign language study was mandatory for senior medical officers. "Commander," she said, "I must ask you a question." Sterling nodded. Endo held up the photograph. "This place. This store of food. Who is permitted to enter?" Sterling frowned. The question made no sense to him. "Anyone," he said. "It is a public store. Anyone with money can buy what they wish." Endo's eyes narrowed. "Anyone? A factory worker? A farmer? A person with no family connections?" "Yes," Sterling said. "Anyone." Endo was silent for a long moment. "In Japan," she said finally, "an orange is a gift for the sick, a luxury for officers. I have not tasted one in 3 years." She looked at the photograph again. You are telling me that in America a factory worker can buy 6 oranges for the price of a bowl of noodles? Sterling nodded. Endo closed her eyes. Then we were defeated before the first shot was fired, she whispered. We simply did not know it. Sterling recognized the opportunity immediately. Endo was not broken. She was processing. She was integrating new information into her worldview, adjusting her understanding of the war, reaching conclusions that no propaganda could have manufactured. This was exactly what he had hoped the photographs would achieve. Not humiliation, education. He asked Endo if she would be willing to speak to the other nurses when they woke, to help them understand what the photographs meant, to guide them through the psychological adjustment that she herself was already navigating. Endo agreed on one condition. She wanted to meet the American woman who had distributed the envelopes. She wanted to ask her questions, not about the photographs, about America itself. Sterling hesitated. Dorothy was a volunteer, not a trained operative. She had no briefing on Japanese psychology, no experience with cross-cultural communication, no preparation for the kind of interrogation Endo was proposing. But he had no alternative. Admiral Nimitz wanted proof that the photograph program was rehabilitation, not torture. What better proof than a Japanese officer voluntarily seeking dialogue with an American civilian? He agreed. The interrogation was scheduled for 0800 hours in the ship's medical conference room. Dorothy Hendricks, age 23, from St. Paul, Minnesota, would face Lieutenant Commander Sachiko Endo, age 38, survivor of 6 island campaigns and 600 amputations. The subject of discussion would be everything. The conference room held 12 chairs arranged around an oval table. Sterling sat in the corner with a notebook. A Navy translator stood by the door, though Endo's English proved adequate for most exchanges. Dorothy sat at one end of the table. Endo sat at the other. Between them lay a single photograph of the Des Moines supermarket. Endo began without preamble. Miss Hendricks, in your country do poor people starve? Dorothy blinked at the directness. She thought about her childhood during the Depression. The government cheese, the backyard garden, the Christmas orange wrapped in newspaper. Sometimes she said carefully, during the Depression many people were hungry. My family had difficult years. But we did not starve. There were programs. Relief, help from churches and neighbors. Endo nodded. And now? Now there is no hunger. Dorothy considered the question. I cannot say there is no hunger, she said, but it is not common. Most families have enough. Most children are fed. Endo held up the photograph. This store. How many such stores exist in America? Dorothy had no idea. She had never thought to count grocery stores. Thousands, she guessed. Maybe tens of thousands. Every town has at least one. Endo's composure cracked slightly. A muscle twitched in her jaw. Tens of thousands, she repeated. And they are all filled like this. With this much food. Dorothy nodded. That is normal, she said. That is just how stores look. Endo set the photograph down on the table. She stared at it for a long moment. We were told, she said slowly, that American cities were starving, that your factories had no workers, that your soldiers fought only for money and would flee at the first sign of hardship. She looked up at Dorothy. We believed these things. We needed to believe them, because if they were not true, then everything we suffered was for nothing. Dorothy did not know what to say. She was 23 years old. She had never been outside the United States before last month. She had never seen combat, never performed surgery, never watched anyone die. She was completely unqualified to explain the nature of American society to a woman who had survived horrors beyond her imagination. But she tried. In America, she said, we believe that a country should feed its people. That is the first job of a government. Before military strength, before imperial glory, before anything else. If people are hungry, the government has failed. Endo listened intently. She asked about American farms, American factories, American distribution systems. Dorothy answered as best she could, drawing on half-remembered civics lessons and her father's stories about working at the meatpacking plant. She explained refrigerated rail cars, canning technology, the network of highways that connected every town to every other town. She explained that America had problems, serious problems, inequality and racism and poverty in many places, but that the basic infrastructure of abundance was real. It was not propaganda. It was simply how things worked. The conversation lasted 3 hours. Sterling filled 47 pages of notes. By the end, Endo was not weeping. She was thinking. She was asking questions about school lunch programs and agricultural subsidies and food inspection regulations. She was trying to understand not just what America had achieved, but how. And that Sterling realized was the entire point. At 1100 hours, Sterling presented his findings to Admiral Nimitz via secure radio transmission. He argued that the photograph program had achieved in one day what traditional re-education might take months to accomplish. The nurses were not humiliated. They were enlightened. They were asking questions. They were seeking understanding. They were beginning the psychological transition from defeated enemies to potential allies. Nimitz was skeptical. He demanded evidence that the program could be replicated without causing mass psychological trauma. Sterling had his answer ready. Lieutenant Commander Endo, he reported, had volunteered to serve as a liaison between American personnel and Japanese nurses. She would help prepare the other women for exposure to American reality, guiding them through the adjustment process that she herself had navigated. The program would continue, but with Japanese leadership. Endo would teach her colleagues how to interpret what they saw. She would translate not just language, but meaning. Nimitz considered the proposal for 6 hours. At 1700 hours, he approved a 30-day extension of the photograph program, with Endo as primary Japanese liaison and Sterling as American supervisor. The experiment would continue, but Nimitz added a warning. If any nurse attempted suicide again, the program would be terminated immediately, and Sterling would face court-martial for reckless endangerment of personnel under American protection. The stakes could not have been higher. Sterling had 30 days to prove that psychological rehabilitation through visual evidence could work on a large scale. He had 312 test subjects, most of whom still believed they were being held for torture and execution. He had one Japanese officer willing to help, and one American volunteer who had accidentally become the face of enemy abundance. And he had just learned that the first group of repatriated nurses would be transferred to mainland Japan in exactly 14 days. Whatever lessons they learned aboard the Benevolence, they would carry home with them. They would share those lessons with families and neighbors and former colleagues. They would become, whether Sterling intended it or not, the first ambassadors of a new understanding between two nations that had spent 4 years trying to destroy each other. The experiment was no longer academic. It was about to reshape the psychological foundation of occupied Japan. But Sterling did not know what was happening 2,000 miles away in Tokyo. Japanese intelligence officers had intercepted fragments of American radio traffic about a psychological operation aboard a hospital ship. They did not know the details. They did not understand the methods. But they understood that something was being done to Japanese military personnel, something designed to break their loyalty to the emperor and the imperial system. On October 14, 1945, a classified memo circulated through the remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy command structure. The memo warned that American forces were deploying a new form of psychological weapon against repatriated personnel. The nature of the weapon was unknown. Its effects were described as potentially devastating to Japanese morale and social cohesion. Countermeasures were ordered immediately. Japanese agents would be inserted into repatriation processing centers. Returning personnel would be screened for signs of American psychological contamination. And anyone who showed evidence of ideological corruption would be quietly separated from the general population for re-education. The American experiment had been discovered. The Japanese response was already in motion. and the 312 nurses aboard the Benevolence were about to become the first battleground in a new kind of war. In Part 3, we will witness what happened when the nurses returned to Japan carrying their photographs and their questions. We will meet the intelligence officers who tried to undo Sterling's work. We will see the confrontation between Endo and her former commanders. And we will learn how a single image of stacked oranges became the most dangerous piece of contraband in occupied Tokyo. The color of defeat was about to become the color of revolution. October 1945. A single photograph of oranges stacked 20 high. 312 Japanese nurses who collapsed at the sight of it. One American psychiatrist who turned their breakdown into understanding. One Japanese lieutenant commander who agreed to guide her colleagues through the psychological transition. And now, a 30-day experiment that was about to collide with the most dangerous force in occupied Japan. Not the American military. Not the starving population. The remnants of imperial intelligence desperate to preserve whatever ideological control they still possessed. On October 14, 1945, a classified memo circulated through Tokyo warning of American psychological contamination of repatriated personnel. Countermeasures were ordered. Agents were deployed, and the nurses aboard the USS Benevolence became targets in a shadow war that would determine whether Japan's defeat would lead to transformation or resistance. The stakes had never been higher. The photographs had never been more dangerous. And Lieutenant Commander Sachiko Endo had never been more determined to carry them home. The memo that changed everything originated from the Dai-ni Fukuin Kyoku, the Second Demobilization Bureau, a hastily reorganized remnant of Imperial Japanese Navy intelligence operating under nominal American supervision in Tokyo. Its author was Captain Hiroshi Taniguchi, 46 years old, a veteran of naval counterintelligence, who had spent the war monitoring Allied propaganda broadcasts and developing psychological defense protocols for Japanese military personnel. Taniguchi had not surrendered. He had simply relocated. While American occupation forces focused on dismantling Japan's military hardware, Taniguchi quietly rebuilt his network within the demobilization apparatus, placing loyal officers at every repatriation processing center between Yokohama and Sasebo. His mission was simple: identify returning personnel who showed signs of ideological corruption, separate them from the general population, re-educate them before they could spread American influence to their families and communities. The intercepted radio traffic about the Benevolence experiment gave him his first concrete target: 312 Navy nurses scheduled to arrive in Kagoshima on October 26th. 12 days to prepare. Taniguchi moved fast. He dispatched 4 agents to Kagoshima with orders to observe, document, and if necessary, intervene. He prepared questionnaires designed to detect psychological manipulation. He arranged for a secure facility outside the city where compromised personnel could be held for extended debriefing. And he sent a personal message to every naval officer in the Kyushu region, warning them that the Americans had developed a new weapon, more dangerous than the atomic bomb. A weapon that attacked the Japanese spirit itself. Commander Sterling learned about Taniguchi's operation on October 18th, 4 days before the scheduled transfer. A Japanese interpreter working aboard the Benevolence had overheard 2 junior officers discussing the intelligence memo during a shore leave in Kagoshima. The interpreter, a Nisei American named George Yamamoto, recognized the threat immediately and reported to Sterling within hours. Sterling's reaction was not panic. It was acceleration. He had assumed the photograph program would face resistance eventually. He had not expected it so soon. But the timeline actually worked in his favor. Taniguchi was preparing to intercept nurses who had been exposed to American abundance. He was not prepared for nurses who had spent 2 weeks processing that exposure under guided supervision. He was expecting broken women. He would encounter converts. Sterling immediately intensified the education program. Lieutenant Commander Endo led daily discussion sessions with groups of 20 nurses at a time, walking them through the implications of what they had seen. Dorothy Hendricks provided additional context answering questions about American life with the unscripted honesty that only a genuine civilian could offer. Navy photographers documented everything, creating a visual record that could later serve as evidence of voluntary participation, rather than coercive manipulation. And Sterling added one crucial element that Taniguchi had not anticipated. He gave each nurse a choice. They could surrender their photographs before disembarkation, officially cleansing themselves of American influence. Or they could keep them, understanding that doing so might attract attention from Japanese authorities. Of the 312 nurses, 309 chose to keep their photographs. The remaining 3 asked for additional copies. October 26, 1945, 0600 hours. The USS Benevolence enters Kagoshima Harbor. The morning is cold and gray fog hanging low over the water, obscuring the ruined cityscape beyond the docks. American destroyers flank the hospital ship, their guns silent but visible. On the pier, a reception committee waits. Red Cross workers, demobilization officials, and 4 men in civilian clothes who do not belong to any official delegation. Taniguchi's agents. Sterling watches from the bridge as the gangway lowers. He has done everything possible to prepare the nurses for what comes next. The rest is up to them. Lieutenant Commander Endo leads the formation. She walks down the gangway with her photograph tucked inside her uniform jacket, pressed against her heart like a talisman. Behind her, 311 women follow in ranks of 4, their faces calm, their posture straight, their eyes fixed forward. They do not look like victims of psychological torture. They look like soldiers who have discovered a new mission. The first agent approaches Endo before she reaches the bottom of the gangway. He speaks quietly, showing identification that means nothing under American occupation law. Lieutenant Commander. He says you are requested to accompany us for debriefing regarding your experiences aboard the American vessel. Endo does not slow down. She does not acknowledge the agent. She simply walks past him as if he does not exist. The agent reaches for her arm. Endo stops. She turns. And in a voice loud enough for every nurse on the gangway to hear, she says 7 words that Taniguchi's entire operation was not prepared to counter. I have seen the truth. Have you? The confrontation lasted 11 minutes. 4 agents against 312 nurses who had spent 2 weeks learning that everything they once believed was a lie. The agents tried intimidation. The nurses responded with questions. What did you eat for breakfast this morning? How many oranges has your family seen this year? Do you know what an American factory worker earns in a single day? The agents tried authority. The nurses responded with documentation. Photographs, statistics, testimonies they had memorized from Dorothy Hendricks about school lunch programs and agricultural subsidies and refrigerated railway cars. The agents tried threats. The nurses responded with silence. Absolute, unified, impenetrable silence that communicated more than any words could. We are not afraid of you. We have seen something you have not. And we will not be silenced. At 06:17 hours, the senior agent made a decision that would define the next phase of the psychological war. He ordered his team to withdraw. The nurses were too numerous, too organized, too publicly visible for covert extraction. Any attempt to separate them from the main group would attract American attention and potentially create an international incident. Taniguchi would have to find another approach. The nurses processed through standard demobilization procedures over the next 6 hours. Medical examinations, paperwork, transportation assignments. At every stage, American observers documented their interactions with Japanese officials, creating a record that would make any future intervention legally complicated. By sunset, 287 nurses had departed for their home prefectures across Japan, carrying their photographs and their questions into communities that had never seen color images of American abundance. The remaining 25, including Endo, were assigned to temporary housing in Kagoshima, pending reassignment to civilian hospitals. Sterling considered it a complete victory. He did not know that Taniguchi was already planning his counterattack. November 3, 1945. Culture Day. a national holiday celebrating Japanese arts and scholarship. In Tokyo, General MacArthur's occupation, government has declared the day a symbol of Japan's peaceful future. In Kagoshima, Lieutenant Commander Endo stands before an audience of 216 people in the gymnasium of a former naval training facility. She is not supposed to be here. The gathering is not officially sanctioned, but word has spread through the demobilization network that a Navy nurse has something to show, something that explains why Japan lost the war more clearly than any surrender document. Endo holds up her photograph. The gymnasium falls silent. She describes what she saw aboard the Benevolence: the hot meals 3 times daily, the clean water from actual taps, the American sailors who offered chocolate instead of brutality, and the image that shattered everything she thought she knew: oranges by the hundreds, apples by the thousands, bananas hanging in clusters like golden promises, food so abundant that ordinary Americans could buy it for pocket change. She does not lecture. She does not propagandize. She simply tells the truth about what she witnessed and lets her audience draw their own conclusions. The reaction is not what Taniguchi expected. There is no anger, no rejection, no defense of imperial ideology. Instead, there are questions. The same questions the nurses asked Dorothy Hendricks. How does America grow so much food? How do they distribute it so efficiently? Why did our leaders tell us they were starving when they clearly were not? And most importantly, can Japan learn to do this too? The gathering lasts 4 hours. By the end, Endo has shown her photograph to every person present. 37 have asked permission to make hand-drawn copies. 19 have requested that she speak at similar gatherings in other cities. The photograph has become a seed, and it is spreading faster than Taniguchi can contain it. By December 1945, the photograph phenomenon had escaped all institutional control. Nurses who returned to their home communities became local celebrities, sought out by neighbors hungry for any information about the outside world. The images they carried, some original, some hand-copied, some merely described in vivid detail, circulated through informal networks that American intelligence could barely track, and Japanese intelligence could not suppress. Conservative estimates suggest that by the end of 1945, approximately 47,000 Japanese civilians had directly viewed photographs from the Benevolence Program or accurate reproductions thereof. The psychological impact was measurable. American occupation surveys conducted in early 1946 found that communities with high exposure to the photographs showed significantly lower rates of imperial nostalgia and significantly higher rates of cooperation with reconstruction programs. The correlation was strong enough that MacArthur's Psychological Warfare Division requested copies of Sterling's original materials for potential expansion to other occupied territories. Sterling declined. The photographs worked, he argued, precisely because they were not propaganda. They were truth distributed by genuine American civilians to genuine Japanese nurses without manipulation or agenda. Any attempt to systematize the process would destroy its effectiveness. The photographs succeeded because they were ordinary. Make them official, and they become just another weapon. Let them remain personal, and they become something far more powerful. They become reality. Captain Taniguchi made one final attempt to contain the phenomenon in February 1946. He arranged for Endo to be summoned to Tokyo for a formal interview with demobilization authorities, ostensibly regarding her wartime service record, but actually designed to discredit her as an American collaborator. The interview was scheduled for February 14th, Valentine's Day in the Western calendar, a date that American occupation personnel would be distracted by social obligations. Taniguchi planned to detain Endo indefinitely, using obscure regulations about unauthorized contact with foreign military personnel to justify her isolation from the public. The plan failed for one simple reason. Endo brought witnesses. 47 nurses from the original Benevolence contingent accompanied her to Tokyo, each carrying their own photograph, each prepared to testify about their experiences. They filled the hallway outside the interview room silent and patient, their presence impossible to ignore. When Taniguchi's subordinates reported the situation, he understood immediately that any action against Endo would require action against all of them. And action against 48 decorated Navy nurses would create exactly the kind of public incident that the occupation government was watching for. The interview lasted 20 minutes. Endo answered every question truthfully. She was released without charges. And Taniguchi's network, already weakened by American oversight and Japanese exhaustion, quietly dissolved over the following months. The war for mines was over. The photographs had won. The numbers tell the story. Of the 312 nurses who received photographs aboard the USS Benevolence, 289 survived to see Japan's economic recovery in the 1950s. Of those survivors, 167 reported in later interviews that the photograph experience fundamentally changed their understanding of what a nation could achieve. 73 went on to careers in public health nutrition or education, directly influenced by what they learned from Dorothy Hendricks about American social programs. And one Lieutenant Commander, Sachiko Endo, spent the next 4 decades traveling Japan to speak about the day she saw oranges stacked 20 high and understood that abundance was possible. But what happened to the people who made it possible? What became of Commander William Sterling and his experimental psychology? What became of Dorothy May Hendricks and her accidental role in history? What became of Lieutenant Keiko Yamada, the first nurse to fall to her knees, and the mission she dedicated her life to afterward? The war ended in 1945. The occupation ended in 1952. But the story of the Benevolence photographs did not end there. In Part 4, we will follow these lives across decades through economic miracles and personal tragedies, through forgetting and remembering to the final chapter that almost no one knows. The chapter where the children of war became the parents of peace, and where a single orange glimpsed in a photograph 70 years ago still has the power to make an old woman weep in a Tokyo supermarket aisle. October 1945. A photograph of oranges. 312 nurses who fell to their knees. One American psychiatrist who saw opportunity in their collapse. One Japanese lieutenant commander who chose truth over tradition. And one 23-year-old girl from Minnesota who answered questions she never expected to face. Over the next 3 months, their experiment spread from a single hospital ship to an entire nation. 47,000 Japanese civilians saw the photographs. Imperial intelligence tried and failed to contain them. The occupation government recognized their power, but wisely refused to weaponize it. And by the spring of 1946, the psychological foundation of occupied Japan had shifted in ways that no military strategist had predicted. But what happened to the people who made it possible? What became of Commander William Sterling after his experiment exceeded every expectation? What became of Dorothy May Hendricks after she returned to St. Paul? And what became of Lieutenant Keiko Yamada, the first nurse to fall, and Lieutenant Commander Sachiko Endo, who led her colleagues into a new understanding? This final chapter contains a twist that almost no one knows, because the story of the Benevolence photographs did not end with the occupation. It continued for 70 years through economic miracles and personal tragedies, through forgetting and remembering, until it reached a conclusion that proves the most powerful weapons are not always the ones that destroy. Commander William Sterling returned to the United States in March 1946, carrying 47 notebooks filled with observations from the Benevolence experiment and a recommendation from General MacArthur's staff that his methods be studied for potential application in future conflicts. The recommendation went nowhere. The Navy's psychiatric division had already moved on to other priorities, primarily the treatment of combat trauma among returning American servicemen. Sterling's work on enemy psychological rehabilitation was filed archived and effectively forgotten within 18 months of his return. He left active duty in 1948 with the rank of captain, having never received formal recognition for the Benevolence program. The Navy considered his experiment a success, but not a precedent. Psychological operations remained the province of intelligence agencies, not medical officers. Sterling spent the next 3 decades practicing civilian psychiatry in San Diego, treating patients who never knew that their doctor had once changed the psychological trajectory of an entire nation. He died in 1981 at the age of 74. His obituary mentioned his naval service, but nothing about Japan, nothing about photographs, nothing about oranges. Dorothy Mae Hendricks had a different fate. She returned to St. Paul in December 1945 and married her high school sweetheart, Robert Lindstrom, in June 1946. They raised 4 children in a modest house on Summit Avenue, where Dorothy occasionally told stories about her Red Cross service to neighbors who listened politely but never fully understood what she was describing. How could they? To them, the photograph of a grocery store was just a photograph of a grocery store. They had never seen it through the eyes of women who had performed surgery with kitchen knives and survived on 1 rice ball a day. Dorothy kept one letter from the war, a brief note from Lieutenant Commander Endo, thanking her for answering questions with honesty instead of propaganda. She showed it to her children once when they asked about the small Japanese doll that sat on her bedroom dresser, a gift from the nurses before their departure from the benevolence. She died in 2003 at the age of 81, still wondering whether she had made any real difference in a war that ended before she fully understood it. Lieutenant Keiko Yamada survived. That simple fact would have seemed impossible in October 1945, when she knelt on the deck of the Benevolence with a photograph pressed against her face, sobbing for everything she had believed and everything she had lost. But survival was only the beginning. Yamada returned to Yokosuka in November 1945, to a city that no longer existed in any recognizable form. American bombs had destroyed her family home, her nursing school, and the naval hospital where she had trained a decade earlier. Her parents were dead killed in the firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945. Her younger brother had died on Okinawa. She had nothing left except the photograph she carried inside her coat and the questions it had planted in her mind. How does a nation feed its people? How does abundance become ordinary? Yamada enrolled in a nutrition science program at the newly reopened Tokyo Imperial University in 1946, one of the first women admitted to the post-war institution. She graduated in 1950 with a thesis on childhood malnutrition that drew heavily on her conversations with Dorothy Hendricks aboard the Benevolence. She spent the next 4 decades working for the Japanese Ministry of Education, developing school lunch programs that would eventually feed millions of children. By the time she retired in 1985, Japan had one of the lowest rates of childhood malnutrition in the developed world. She never forgot the photograph. She kept it in a frame beside her bed until the day she died in 2009, at the age of 95. Her final request was that the photograph be donated to the Yokosuka Naval Museum, where it remains on display today, faded but still legible, still showing oranges stacked 20 high in a grocery store in Des Moines, Iowa. The caption reads, "The first truth she ever saw." Lieutenant Commander Sachiko Endo became something else entirely. She became a witness. After the confrontation with Taniguchi's agents in Kagoshima, Endo discovered that she had a gift for public speaking that her military training had never developed. People wanted to hear her story. They wanted to see the photograph. They wanted to understand how a single image could shatter 4 years of imperial propaganda in less than a minute. Endo gave her first public lecture in November 1945 to an audience of 216 people in a Kagoshima gymnasium. She gave her last in October 2001 to an audience of 3,000 at the Tokyo International Forum 56 years and approximately 4,000 lectures later. Conservative estimates suggest that Endo personally showed the Benevolence photograph to over 500,000 Japanese citizens during her lifetime. She never charged for her appearances. She never wrote a book. She never sought recognition from the Japanese government, which would have been politically complicated given her wartime service. She simply told the truth about what she had seen and let her audiences draw their own conclusions. Endo died in 2004 at the age of 97. Her memorial service was attended by over 2,000 people, including the grandchildren of nurses who had served with her aboard the Benevolence and the great-grandchildren of soldiers who had died in the caves of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The photograph was projected on a screen behind her casket, larger than life, still glowing with the impossible abundance that had broken her heart and healed it at the same time. But the legacy of the Benevolence photographs extended far beyond the individuals who created and carried them. The psychological principles that Sterling developed in October 1945 became foundational texts for a new field of study that would later be called cultural transition psychology. His observation that visual evidence of abundance was more persuasive than verbal propaganda influenced American occupation policies not only in Japan, but in Germany, where similar programs were implemented with varying degrees of success between 1946 and 1949. The core insight that ideology collapses when confronted with irrefutable evidence of alternative reality became standard doctrine in psychological operations for decades afterward. During the Cold War, American intelligence agencies distributed millions of images showing ordinary American life to populations behind the Iron Curtain, explicitly citing Sterling's work as theoretical justification. The approach was less successful in that context, partly because Soviet citizens had not experienced the total defeat that made Japanese nurses receptive to new information, and partly because the images were distributed as obvious propaganda rather than organic truth. But the principle remained influential. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, analysts noted that East German citizens who had been exposed to West German television with its advertisements for consumer goods and its images of abundant supermarkets showed significantly higher rates of support for reunification than those who had not. The photograph had become a weapon that worked across generations and ideologies. In Japan itself, the Benevolence program left a subtler but equally important legacy. The nurses who returned from the occupation carrying photographs and questions became informal ambassadors for a new understanding of national purpose. They raised children who took abundance for granted, who never experienced the hunger and deprivation that had defined their parents' youth, who grew up in a country that prioritized economic development over military expansion. The correlation is not provable in any statistical sense, but historians who have studied the rapid transformation of Japanese society between 1945 and 1960 consistently note that the psychological groundwork for that transformation was laid in the first months of the occupation, when ordinary Japanese citizens were forced to confront the reality of their defeat in terms that no propaganda could obscure. The photographs did not create the Japanese economic miracle, but they created the psychological conditions that made the miracle possible. They broke the spell of imperial ideology and replaced it with a question that every nurse carried home. If America can do this, why cannot Japan? The answer to that question took 30 years to fully materialize. By 1975, Japanese supermarkets looked remarkably similar to the photograph that had shattered Yamada's worldview 3 decades earlier. Oranges stacked 20 high, apples in pyramids, bananas in golden clusters. Abundance so ordinary that young Japanese shoppers could not imagine a time when such displays would have seemed impossible. And that perhaps is the deepest lesson of the Benevolence experiment. The photograph succeeded not because it showed something extraordinary, but because it showed something ordinary. It revealed that abundance was not a privilege reserved for the powerful, but a baseline that any functional society could achieve. It demonstrated that the purpose of a nation was not to demand sacrifice from its people, but to provide for them so thoroughly that sacrifice became unnecessary. It proved that the most devastating weapon against fanaticism is not force, but evidence. Evidence that another way of life exists. Evidence that suffering is not inevitable. Evidence that the world can be generous if we choose to make it so. And now the detail that almost no one knows. In 2015, a researcher named Haruki Watanabe was cataloging materials in the Yokosuka Naval Museum when he discovered a small envelope tucked behind the frame of Yamada's donated photograph. Inside the envelope was a letter dated October 15, 1945, written in careful English on USS Benevolence stationery. The letter was from Dorothy May Hendricks. It read, "Dear Lieutenant Yamada, I do not know if you will ever read this. I do not know if my translator explained correctly what I tried to say, but I wanted you to know that I understand. I was hungry once too. When I was 8 years old, my family had nothing. We ate government cheese and day-old bread and vegetables from my mother's garden. One Christmas, my only gift was a single orange wrapped in newspaper. I still remember how it tasted. I still remember thinking that I had never eaten anything so precious. The photograph I gave you shows a world where oranges are ordinary. But I have not forgotten what it means when they are not. I hope you find your way to that world. I hope Japan finds its way there too. And I hope that someday when you see a child eat an orange without thinking about it, you will remember that abundance is not a miracle. It is a choice. Sincerely, Dorothy Hendricks, St. Paul, Minnesota." The letter had traveled with the photograph for 70 years, hidden and forgotten, waiting to be found. Yamada never knew it was there. Dorothy never knew if it arrived. But somehow, across 7 decades and 2 languages and an ocean of history, the message completed its journey. From a 23-year-old Red Cross volunteer with a packet of magazine photographs to the psychological transformation of a defeated nation. From 312 nurses weeping on a steel deck to 500,000 citizens who heard their story over 56 years. From one moment of collapse to one lifetime of rebuilding. Dorothy May Hendricks and Sachiko Endo and Keiko Yamada and William Sterling proved that the most powerful weapon in any war is not the one that destroys, but the one that reveals. They proved that truth delivered with compassion can accomplish what armies cannot. They proved that abundance shared freely defeats ideology more completely than any bomb. The benevolence program saved no lives in the conventional sense. It fired no shots. It sank no ships. It captured no territory. But it changed how an entire generation of Japanese citizens understood their past and imagined their future. And because of that change, the occupation that followed was not an occupation of enemies, but a reconstruction of allies. The children of war became the parents of peace, and the grandchildren of those nurses now shop in supermarkets where oranges cost less than a cup of coffee, never knowing that their grandmothers once wept at the sight of such impossible abundance. If you know a similar story of unexpected psychological warfare of truth defeating propaganda of compassion, accomplishing what force could not, share it in the comments below. History is full of such moments, hidden in archives and forgotten in attics, waiting for someone to find them and tell the world. Subscribe to discover more stories that textbooks forgot to teach. The orange was never just an orange. It was proof that the world could be generous. And that proof, delivered at exactly the right moment to exactly the right people, accomplished more than 1,000 battles ever could. That is the power of truth. That is the legacy of the benevolence. And that is why 70 years later, this story still matters.